There was a particular kind of silence on a summer morning in a black neighborhood in the 1970s. And I need you to understand that it was not really silence at all. If you pressed your ear toward it and listened right, you could hear screen doors beginning to open all up and down the street. You could hear the low murmur of car engines warming up before the sun had gotten good and high. You could hear the sound of aluminum foil being pulled across a long stretch of casserole dish. You could hear women on the telephone, voices low but urgent, settling the last few details of something that had been planned since February. A family reunion was coming. And in a black family in the 1970s, that was not simply a gathering. It was a reckoning. It was the one day in the calendar year when every branch of the family tree was expected to show up with something. Not just their body, something in their hands. Because the women of this community understood what the table meant. They understood it on a level that wasn't spoken and didn't need to be. The table was proof. Proof that the family was still standing. Proof that the recipes had survived. Proof that what your grandmother's grandmother learned to do with limited means had not been swallowed up by time or geography or the drift that pulled families apart from one generation to the next. I want to take you back there today. I want to walk you through a family reunion spread the way it actually was. Not the way nostalgia softens it, but the way it tasted, and the way it smelled, and the way it sat in your stomach and stayed with you for 3 days afterward. Hey family, I'm James. And today we are going back to the 1970s, to those long folding tables set up in a church fellowship hall or somebody's backyard. And we are going through 23 of the most unforgettable dishes that showed up at every black family reunion during that decade. Not a list, a memory. Now, if this is your first time visiting us here, do me a favor before we go one step further. Hit that subscribe button right now. We are building a family here. A community of folks who remember what we came from and understand why it still matters. So go on, hit subscribe, ring that bell so you don't miss a single video, and let's get into it. Now I'm going to take you through this the way a reunion actually happened. From the moment the morning light hit the driveway and the first car pulled up, all the way through to when the sun started going down and somebody's uncle was asleep in a lawn chair with a paper plate on his chest. Because the food didn't all appear at once, it came in waves. And knowing which dishes came at which hour, that tells you everything you need to know about how these families organized themselves around the act of feeding one another. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start at morning. Number 1, deviled eggs. Child, let me tell you something. Deviled eggs were never just deviled eggs at a black family reunion. They were a statement. They were the opening argument. Every woman who made them believed, and I mean believed with her whole chest, that hers were the best ones on the table, and she had been perfecting her particular version since sometime in the early 1960s. They showed up first. Before anything was set out, before the grill was even lit, someone's aunt had already pulled back the plastic wrap on a deviled egg platter, and those pale yellow-white ovals were sitting there in their little dimples, waiting. Now the base formula was the same everywhere. Boiled egg, yolk mashed up with Duke's mayonnaise, yellow mustard, a splash of sweet pickle relish. But then you got into the variations. Some women added a pinch of sugar to theirs. Some added a small amount of onion powder, fine as powder, so you tasted it before you knew you tasted it. Some ran a thin slice of pimiento olive down the center and dusted the top with paprika, so red it looked like they'd spent extra money. And nobody wrote these things down. These were carried in the head and in the hands. My grandmother made 12 dozen eggs for every reunion. 12 dozen. And every single one of them was gone by noon. That was just how it was done. Number 2, potato salad. If deviled eggs were the opening argument, potato salad was the evidence submitted in court. And in a black family in the 1970s, the potato salad question could fracture an alliance faster than almost anything I can name. Did you use yellow mustard, or did you use a small amount of the yellow alongside something creamier? Did you put celery in yours? Somebody's mama put celery in hers, and somebody else's mama went to her grave convinced that celery did not belong anywhere near a potato salad, and she was not ashamed to say so. But here is what united every version of this dish across every region of Black America in that decade. The potatoes were cooked until they were soft all the way through, not firm, not al dente, whatever that word means in Italian, not any of that. Soft. They were cubed, and they were allowed to cool slightly before the dressing went in. Then came the hard-boiled eggs, folded in so they broke up into pieces rather than staying whole. Then sweet pickle relish. Then yellow onion, diced fine. Then dukes, or Hellmann's if you were in the north. Then the mustard. Then a shake of celery salt. Then a dusting of paprika on top, because presentation mattered even in a backyard. This went into the refrigerator overnight, always. The potato salad that someone made the morning of the reunion was acceptable. The potato salad that sat overnight was otherworldly. Number 3. Baked beans. Now, we are still in the morning hours, still in the setting up phase, still in the hour before the main grills were producing their full heat. And somebody, it was almost always an older woman, the one who arrived earliest, had already set up the portable burner or commandeered a corner of the kitchen stove for the pot of baked beans. And the smell that was coming off that pot was something that does not have a precise equivalent in the modern vocabulary of food. You are talking about dried navy beans that had been soaked overnight, simmered until tender, then combined with fatback or salt pork cut into pieces, with dark molasses, not light, not honey dark, with brown sugar packed firm in the measuring cup, with yellow mustard for the bite, with ketchup for the body, with diced onion for the depth. Some women threw in a piece of smoked ham hock and let it sit at the bottom of the pot like an anchor, releasing its smokiness into every bean for 3 hours. The resulting pot was sweet and smoky and dark and had a thickness to it that told you immediately this had been cooking since before you woke up. These beans went into a cast-iron Dutch oven when it was time to transport them. And when the lid came off at the reunion table, the steam that came up, the steam that came up was a blessing in and of itself. Number 4. Fried chicken. Now I want to be careful here, because to say fried chicken and leave it at that is to do a disservice to something that deserves its own documentary series. In the context of a black family reunion in the 1970s, fried chicken was not any particular recipe. It was the architecture of a woman's identity as a cook, and every woman who brought fried chicken to a reunion had her architecture. Some soaked their chicken in buttermilk overnight, seasoned with hot sauce and salt, and the coating they dredged it in the next morning had been seasoned separately with garlic powder and black pepper and a measured amount of cayenne, and they coated it twice. Some used a cast-iron skillet with Crisco shortening, not oil, Crisco, heated until a wooden spoon handle held in the fat produced a slow, steady stream of bubbles before a single piece of chicken touched it. Some had a Dutch oven, and they used it as a fryer, so the chicken cooked surrounded by fat on all sides and came out in 12 minutes. The coating caramel brown and shattering, the inside still releasing steam when you pulled it apart. My granddaddy worked 6 days a week and never once complained, but on the Saturday before the reunion, he sat in the kitchen and watched my grandmother make fried chicken for 2 hours, and did not say a single word because he understood that what was happening in that kitchen was not cooking. It was something closer to ceremony. Number 5. Cornbread. In the South, cornbread was its own theological debate. Sweet or unsweetened, skillet or pan, crackling in the batter or plain. And at a family reunion, you might find 2 or 3 versions on the table simultaneously, representing 3 different philosophies from 3 different branches of the family tree. The most respected version, the one the older women insisted upon, was made in a cast-iron skillet that had been in the family long enough to be considered an heirloom. Not a metaphorical heirloom, a literal one. The seasoning on that skillet went back decades. You heated the skillet in the oven first, then you poured your batter, a combination of stone-ground white cornmeal, not yellow, 1 egg, buttermilk, a small amount of bacon drippings from the jar kept on the back of the stove, a pinch of baking soda, a pinch of salt, no sugar, into the hot skillet. And the moment that batter hit the iron, you could hear it sizzle, and that sizzle told you the crust was forming immediately from the bottom up. It went into a 400-degree oven for 22 minutes and came out with a bottom crust the color of a copper penny and a top that was pale gold and slightly domed in the center. and when you turned it out onto a cutting board, it made a sound, a particular hollow sound, that told you it was right. Number 6. Collard greens. Back in those days, nobody at a family reunion was explaining what collard greens were to anybody. You either grew up eating them, or you married into a family that did. Either way, you understood the rules. And the first rule was this: they had to cook long enough. There was no shortcut. You could not make collard greens in 45 minutes and present them at a reunion table without somebody noticing. Somebody always noticed. The greens were started the day before in many households. Smoked neck bones or smoked turkey tails went into the pot first. This was the 1970s, before turkey tails became the health-conscious substitute. But many women in this era were already beginning to make the shift, with water and onion and a small amount of apple cider vinegar and a pinch of sugar and a generous hand of salt. That pot simmered for an hour before a single leaf of collard greens touched it. Then the greens went in, washed and stripped from the stems and torn into pieces, and they cooked down into the pot liquor. That's what they called it, pot liquor. And the liquid turned dark as tea and became something worth saving in a cup and drinking on its own. The greens cooked until they were tender enough to yield completely when you pressed them between your tongue and the roof of your mouth. No bite left. No resistance. Just the deep, mineral, smoky taste of something that had been given the full measure of time. Number 7. Macaroni and cheese. Now I want to pause here and make something clear, because this has been a point of confusion for too long. What was served at a black family reunion in the 1970s was not macaroni and cheese from a box. It was not the orange powder stirred into butter and milk. That was a weekday morning children's dish, and it had its place. What appeared on the reunion table was a completely different creation, and it deserves a different name, except that the family had only one name for it, and they used it with pride: macaroni and cheese. This began with elbow macaroni, cooked slightly past the usual doneness, because it was going to go into the oven, and it needed a small margin. The cooked macaroni went into a large baking dish, glass, usually, the deep kind that held enough to feed a large group. And then came the process that each woman performed slightly differently. There was always sharp cheddar. Always. Cubed and shredded in combination because the cubes melted into pockets and the shredded cheese formed the golden crust. There was always egg in the custard. 2 or 3 eggs beaten with whole milk and evaporated milk combined, poured over the macaroni and cheese until it came nearly to the top. There was pepper. There was a small amount of butter cut into pats and set on the surface before the dish went into the oven. The dish baked at 350 degrees for somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour until the top was golden and slightly puffed, and when you pressed it with a spoon, it held its shape for a moment before yielding. That was the test. If it held for a moment, it was ready. Folks don't do this anymore, and that's a shame. Because what they're missing is not a side dish. It is a work of art made out of simple materials by women who had learned that simplicity, treated with patience, produces something extraordinary. Now, before we keep going, I want to stop for a minute and hear from you, family. I want you to think about a reunion dish, not just any dish. The one that your grandmother or your mother brought to every reunion without fail. The one that you made a beeline for the second the food table was uncovered. The one that if you showed up and it wasn't there, your whole afternoon was off. Drop that dish in the comments right now. Tell me what it was, who made it, and what state you were in. I read every single comment that comes through this channel, and I have a feeling there are people watching this right now who had somebody in their family making the exact same thing, and they need to know they're not alone in missing it. Go on, drop it in the comments. We'll be right here. Now let's move into the afternoon. Because by the time the sun was overhead and the reunion was in full swing, children running, men stationed around the grill, old women fanning themselves in lawn chairs, the table was filling up in ways the morning didn't predict. This is when the heavier dishes started arriving from car trunks, still warm from ovens that had been shut off 30 minutes before the drive. Number 8. Smothered pork chops. There was a category of cooking in the black community that didn't have an official name, but that everyone recognized on sight. And it could be summarized in one word: smothered. To smother something was to cook it low and slow in a gravy that you built from the drippings of the meat itself, with onions softened down to translucence, and a roux of flour and fat that thickened the whole thing into something that coated the back of a spoon. Smothered pork chops were the flagship of this tradition, and they appeared at reunions wrapped tight in foil to hold in the steam and the moisture. And when the foil was pulled back, what was underneath was not merely cooked meat. It was a statement about patience. The chops were thick, an inch and a half at the bone. They were seasoned with salt and black pepper and garlic powder, and then dredged in flour and seared in a pan with oil or lard until they had developed a golden crust on each side, and then they were set aside while the gravy built itself around them. Onions went in and cooked until caramel. A little flour stirred constantly. Then chicken broth added slowly, and the pork chops went back in, buried under the gravy and covered with a tight lid, and they cooked on low for an hour. When they came back up, they had given something of themselves to the gravy, and the gravy had given something of itself back to them, and the result was a kind of unity between meat and sauce that most modern cooking does not attempt to achieve. Number 9. Candied yams. Now, a sweet potato cooked plain is a fine thing. But in the context of a black family reunion in the 1970s, nobody brought a plain sweet potato anywhere near a table. What they brought was candied yams, and the candy component was not a glaze applied after the fact. It was a covenant entered into during the cooking process. The yams, and in this era and in this community, yams and sweet potatoes were used interchangeably, and the distinction was not one that anyone at the table was going to debate while there was food to eat, were peeled and sliced into rounds, not too thin, not too thick, somewhere around a 1/4 inch. They went into a baking dish in overlapping layers. And over each layer went a combination of butter in pats, light brown sugar packed firm, ground cinnamon, ground nutmeg, and a small pour of pure vanilla extract. Some women added a splash of orange juice. Some added a pinch of ground cloves. Some added miniature marshmallows on top for the final 15 minutes of baking, and this was a generational dividing line in some families. The grandmothers considered marshmallows an affectation. The mothers used them anyway. The dish went into the oven and baked until the sweet potato slices were fully tender, and the syrup that had formed from the butter and sugar and juice from the yams had thickened and bubbled at the edges and turned a deep amber color, like something a candy maker would recognize. The smell that came off that dish was warm and spiced and sweet, and it carried across a backyard in a way that could stop a conversation mid-sentence. Number 10. Black-eyed peas. These were never just a New Year's dish to the people we're talking about. In a black Southern family, black-eyed peas had a year-round presence on the table, and at a reunion in the 1970s they showed up as a matter of course, the way breathing is a matter of course. They were practical, dried peas were inexpensive and they stretched, but they were also beloved in a way that went beyond practicality. They were cooked with smoked meat. Always. A ham hock was the traditional choice, but smoked turkey wings were already making their appearance in some households by the early 1970s. The peas were soaked overnight, rinsed in the morning, and cooked in fresh water with the smoked meat and with a generous amount of diced onion and a pod or two of dried red pepper for a background heat that never jumped to the foreground. Salt came in at the end, not the beginning. This was a rule the older women enforced, because they had learned that salting early made the skin of the peas tough. By the time these peas came to the table, they were tender all the way through. The pot liquor was seasoned and slightly smoky, and the whole thing poured over a piece of cornbread was one of the most complete and satisfying meals a person could construct out of humble materials. Number 11. Fried catfish. If there was a man at the reunion who had been down to the creek or the river the week before, and if that man had come back with catfish, there was going to be a fry. It was that simple. The fish fry at a reunion was not a separate event. It was an enhancement of the ongoing table. A large cast-iron pot, or a propane burner with a deep pan of oil, was set up away from the children, and the catfish fillets, scored with a knife along the surface so the coating had more surface to grip, were dredged in a mixture of yellow cornmeal and a small amount of flour, seasoned with salt and cayenne and black pepper, and they went into oil that was hot enough to produce that immediate, aggressive sizzle that means the crust is setting from the outside in. The catfish cooked fast. 3 minutes on one side, 2 on the other, and the fillet came out of the oil the color of a harvest moon, placed on a rack or on paper bags to drain, and it hit the table while it was still crackling. You did not eat cold-fried catfish at a reunion. You ate it hot, and you ate it with hot sauce, and you ate it standing up because there was no time for the formality of finding a seat. Number 12. Hot water cornbread. This was different from the skillet cornbread from the morning. This was fast food in the original sense of the word, something a woman could produce in 10 minutes while other things were cooking, and it was made by mixing plain cornmeal with a small amount of salt and pouring in enough boiling water to bring the mixture to a consistency that could be handled and formed by hand. Small patties were shaped, not too thin, about 1/3 of an inch, and dropped directly into hot oil in a skillet. They cooked for 3 minutes on each side and came out crisp on the outside and dense and slightly chewy on the inside, with a flavor that was purely corn and salt and the memory of whatever oil they cooked in. No baking powder, no egg, no milk, just cornmeal, salt, and boiling water. And people ate these hot with their fingers, and they ate 6 or 7 of them without thinking about it. This was the dish you made when the first batch of cornbread was gone, and people were still asking for something to sop up their greens with. This was the answer. Number 13. Neck bones and rice. Now Big Mama, she used to say that the people who knew how to eat were the people who knew that flavor lived in the bones. And there was no better demonstration of that truth than smoked neck bones over rice. This was not a glamorous dish. It was not a dish that required explanation or presentation. It was a pot of smoked pork neck bones cooked with onion and garlic and seasoning until the meat was falling away from the bone in shreds, and then that pot liquor, that deeply flavored, smoky, slightly gelatinous broth, was ladled over white rice. The rice soaked it up. The pieces of meat were pulled from the bones at the table. And what you ended up with was a combination of flavors and textures that no expensive cut of meat can replicate, because the slow extraction of collagen and marrow and smoke from those bones produces something that does not exist anywhere else. Children at the reunion were sometimes puzzled by this dish. They wanted the fried chicken. They wanted the ribs. But the older adults came back to the neck bones the way they came back to a song they'd known since childhood, without thinking about it, out of something that was deeper than preference. Number 14. Pig feet. I'm going to say this plainly, family. Pig feet are not a dish that requires an apology. They do not require context or hedging, or the kind of preamble that suggests you're about to say something controversial. Pig feet were a staple on the black reunion table in the 1970s, and they were eaten by people who understood that when you cook something long enough, the right way, the result is not a concession to poverty. It is a triumph of technique. The feet were cleaned and split and boiled in a pot with vinegar and salt and black pepper and red pepper flakes and bay leaves and onion, and they cooked for a long time, 2 hours or more, until the skin and the soft tissue around the cartilage had turned tender and yielding, and the broth had become rich with collagen. Some women then pickled them afterward in a brine of vinegar and sugar and spices and kept them in mason jars. Others served them directly from the pot, whole, with a side of hot sauce and a piece of cornbread. The people who ate pig feet at the reunion were not the people who needed to be convinced. They were the ones who arrived knowing what they were looking for. Number 15. Pound cake. Now we are moving toward the afternoon, moving toward the time when the heat of the day is at its highest, and the children are circling the table for the 3rd time, and the elders are settled in their chairs, and the conversation has deepened into the long-form storytelling that only happens when people have been together for several hours and the formality is worn off. And it is at this point that the desserts began to be uncovered. The pound cake was first. There was always a pound cake. And in a black family in the 1970s, the pound cake was not purchased. It was made in a bundt pan or a tube pan that had belonged to someone's mother, and the recipe was carried in the head of the woman who made it, not written down in any book, because the recipe was not really a recipe at all. It was a set of ratios and observations and adjustments that a woman had developed over years of baking. a pound of butter, a pound of sugar, a pound of flour, 6 eggs, added one at a time, vanilla, a small amount of lemon extract if the woman was partial to it, sour cream in some households, which kept the crumb dense and moist for days. The exterior crust of a properly made pound cake was golden and slightly caramelized from the butter that had been used to grease the pan, and it had a faint resistance when you pressed it with your finger, and the interior was dense and fine-grained and slightly yellow from the eggs and butter, and it tasted like something that had been made with the specific intention of lasting, of being present and abundant and steady. Number 16. Sweet potato pie. Alongside the pound cake, and sometimes before it in terms of being cut into, was the sweet potato pie. And here is something I want you to understand about sweet potato pie in this community. It was not a consolation for not having pumpkin pie. That is a comparison that people make who did not grow up eating it, and it is a comparison that does not hold up to a single bite of the real thing. Sweet potato pie began with sweet potatoes that were roasted, not boiled, roasted, until their natural sugars had caramelized inside the skin, and the flesh came out of the oven already partially sweetened by its own transformation in the heat. The flesh was then scooped out and mashed until smooth, and into that smooth base went butter and sugar and eggs and evaporated milk and ground cinnamon and ground nutmeg and a pinch of allspice and vanilla extract. The filling was deep orange, richer in color than pumpkin, with a flavor that was earthier and sweeter and more complex. It went into a butter crust made from scratch, lard and flour and ice water, crimped at the edges by hand, and baked until the filling was set but still had a barely perceptible tremble at the center when you moved the pan. You ate a slice of sweet potato pie at a reunion, and you did not say anything for a moment. That was the proper response. Number 17. Banana pudding. Now this right here, this is something we need to bring back. Not the version assembled from a box of vanilla wafers and a packet of instant pudding, though I will say that version has its adherents, and they are not entirely wrong. No, I mean the banana pudding that someone's mother made from scratch, with a cooked vanilla custard that she stood at the stove and stirred for 20 minutes, not walking away, not checking anything else, just stirring, because you could not look away from a custard, or it would turn on you. The custard was poured over layers of vanilla wafers, Nilla wafers, the yellow box, and sliced bananas that had been allowed to ripen to the point where they were sweet all the way through, not green, not overripe, but at the precise moment when a banana is most fully itself. And over the top went a meringue made from egg whites beaten stiff with sugar until they formed peaks that held, and that meringue was browned in the oven until it had the color of a harvest wheat field. The resulting dish was then allowed to cool, covered, and the vanilla wafers softened overnight into the custard and became something between a wafer and a cake, and the banana slices perfumed the whole thing with a sweetness that was gentle and pervasive. This went into the largest bowl in the house, and the bowl was still insufficient. Number 18. Peach cobbler. In the months when peaches were coming off the trees in the South, and in the 1970s, in black communities in Georgia and Alabama and the Carolinas, there were still actual peach trees in backyards and in community plots and down back roads. The peach cobbler at a reunion was made with fresh peaches, and fresh peaches in this context means peaches that still smelled like something alive. Peaches whose juice ran down your arm when you peeled them, peaches that required a bowl to catch what fell from them. The peaches were peeled and sliced and tossed with sugar and a small amount of cinnamon and nutmeg, and set aside while a batter was made. Butter melted in the baking pan itself in the oven, so that when the batter was poured in, it went around the butter rather than being mixed with it, and the butter rose up through the batter as it baked, creating something between a cake and a crust. The peach mixture went on top of the batter, and the whole pan went into the oven, and what emerged 45 minutes later was not a pie, and not a cake, and not a crisp, but something that was its own category entirely. A peach cobbler, bubbling at the edges, the batter golden and slightly crisp at the top where it had surfaced through the peach syrup. You ate it warm, with ice cream if there was ice cream, without ice cream if there wasn't, and you did not notice the absence. Number 19. Red velvet cake. Now this cake did not come from a mix. I want to be very specific about that. In the 1970s, in a black family that took its reunion food seriously, the red velvet cake came from a woman's own recipe. And that recipe had 2 tablespoons of cocoa powder and 2 ounces of red food coloring. The small bottles, 2 of them, their entire contents, folded into a buttermilk batter. And the red color was not accent. It was presence. That cake was red the way a cardinal is red. Unmistakably, unapologetically. The layers came out of round pans, 2 or 3 of them, and they were assembled with a cream cheese frosting that had been introduced into the recipe canon sometime in the 1960s and had become standard by the early 1970s. Cream cheese beaten smooth with butter and powdered sugar and a small amount of vanilla, and it was tart where the cake was sweet, and the combination was correct. The finished cake sat on a glass cake stand at the center of the dessert end of the table, and it had a presence about it. People would take a picture of it before cutting into it. That was the 1970s version of what people now do with food on their phones, except that the photograph was taken with a Polaroid camera, and the image took 60 seconds to develop, and the woman who made the cake kept it. Number 20. Tea cakes. These were humble. They were deliberately humble. And in their humbleness, they were perhaps the most honest thing on the dessert table. A tea cake was a soft, dense, barely sweetened cookie, though cookie is not quite the right word, made with flour and butter and sugar and eggs and a small amount of buttermilk and vanilla and nutmeg, just that. The dough was rolled out and cut into rounds and baked until barely golden, and they emerged from the oven soft, and they stayed soft for days, which made them ideal for tucking into a jacket pocket when you left the reunion, and eating later with a cup of coffee or sweet tea. Children at the reunion were sometimes overlooked by them, too plain, compared to the red velvet cake and the banana pudding. But the older people at the table, the ones who had grown up in households where sugar was not plentiful and flour was bought by the sack, and food coloring was not something anyone had money for, those people reached for the tea cakes with a quiet pleasure that was not about the flavor alone. It was about recognition. It was about the taste of something real. Number 21. Lemon pound cake. This was a variation on the pound cake tradition, and in some families it was its own category entirely. Not a modification of the standard recipe, but a completely separate cake with its own standing. The lemon pound cake introduced fresh lemon zest into the batter, folded in with a light hand so that the oils from the skin of the lemon distributed through the crumb without making it bitter. Fresh lemon juice went into a glaze that was poured over the hot cake the moment it came out of the pan. A combination of powdered sugar and lemon juice thin enough to pour, but thick enough to set into a glaze that crackled slightly when you cut through it. This cake was kept covered with a glass dome or a dish towel, and it was the cake that got better over time. The first slice was good. The second day's slice was better. By the third day, if it lasted to the third day, which it sometimes did not, the lemon flavor had deepened through the crumb, and the glaze had softened into the exterior, and the whole thing had become a unified object, dense and bright and present. Number 22. Homemade lemonade. I need to give this its full due, because to call this a drink is to understate it. Homemade lemonade at a black family reunion in the 1970s was a production. It was made in a large glass pitcher or a 5-gallon water cooler, and it was made with real lemons, a volume of lemons that required multiple trips through a handheld juicer and someone to catch the seeds with a piece of cheesecloth, and a simple syrup made by dissolving sugar in hot water rather than stirring cold sugar directly into cold juice, because the simple syrup dissolved completely and the standard granulated sugar never fully did, and you could always taste the difference. The lemonade was made tart first and adjusted toward sweet. Never made sweet first, because that was how you lost the brightness, and it was served over ice, and in the southern heat of a July afternoon reunion, it was consumed by the glass, and by the half glass, and by the children who walked around with cups in their hands all afternoon, and appeared at the table 7 and 8 times. There was always enough. Making enough was a point of honor. You won't see that today. Lemonade from a can, from a powder packet, from a bottle with a label. What they were drinking at those reunions had no label. It had lemons and sugar and water and the work of someone's hands. And you tasted all of those things in every glass. Number 23, sweet tea. And at last, we come to the one that was there from the first car arriving in the morning to the last car pulling out in the evening, with children asleep in the back seat. Sweet tea. Not iced tea with sugar added. Sweet tea, which means tea that has been brewed strong, usually from 4 to 6 family-sized tea bags steeped in hot water for the right amount of time, not too long, because too long makes it bitter, and then the sugar going into the hot tea before the ice, because the sugar dissolves fully in hot tea and does not in cold. And then the whole thing poured over ice in a gallon pitcher and set in the shade or in a cooler, and kept at a temperature that meant every glass you poured was cold enough to make the outside of the glass sweat. Back in those days, sweet tea was not a novelty. It was not something that appeared on a restaurant menu as a specialty item. It was what you offered to anyone who came through your door, the way other cultures offered bread and salt. You had sweet tea and you gave it freely, and you made more when the pitcher ran low. At a reunion in the 1970s, the sweet tea disappeared faster than anything else on the table except possibly the fried chicken. Children drank it. Old men drank it. Women who had been standing in the heat all morning organizing the food and managing the logistics and keeping the younger children from running into the dessert table, they drank sweet tea, and for a moment they closed their eyes. That moment. That is what a family reunion was. Not the food, though the food was extraordinary. Not the organization, though the organization represented a genuine achievement by the women who made it happen. But that moment, the moment when someone closed their eyes over a cold glass of sweet tea in the shade on a summer afternoon surrounded by family, that was the point. That was what all of it was for. Family. We have been walking through a reunion together today. 23 dishes that represented a way of feeding each other that took decades to build, and that we have allowed to slip away faster than it should have. Not all of it is gone. In some families, in some reunion traditions that are still being kept, some of these dishes are still appearing on tables in the summer. If that is you, if your family is still doing this, hold on to it. Not just the recipes, the act. The act of a family deciding that once a year they are going to come together in one place with everything they know how to make and share it until the table is full and the afternoon is gone and the children are asleep in the grass. These women who cooked these dishes were not celebrated chefs. They were not on television. They were not building brands or following trends. They were doing what they understood to be their responsibility to the family and their responsibility to time itself, which is to say their responsibility to pass something forward. And what they passed forward was not just recipes. It was the knowledge that a family at a table is a family that is still standing, and a family that is still standing cannot be forgotten. I'll see you next time, family.